Hello and welcome to the All About Pigeons podcast. We have a very special episode for you today, so stick around. Today we have with us Ken Easley from Ken Easley and Sons Racing Pigeon Lofts, where they breed some of the best racing pigeons that are available today. Ken has too long of a list of wins to read off. Some of the bigger ones he has first, second, third, fourth, fifth, all the way to 12th place on a race out of 450 birds. There was a lot of races like that where his birds were just clenching the whole front half. He has 7 National AU Ace Pigeon qualifiers, 3 AU National Hall of Fame pigeons, a lot of wins that he has had on his own, and then the birds that he breeds have also got a pretty respectable list of wins. So today we're going to talk about what makes a good racing pigeon. And Ken, thanks for coming on and talking with us.
Thanks for having me.
So let's talk about your background. You're a third generation pigeon fancier. What was it like, and how did you first get into pigeons?
I am a third generation. One of my earliest memories in my life is my grandfather holding me up when I was about 2 or 3 years old. He held me up so I could see inside the nest 2 little fuzzy baby squabs that just hatched. And I still remember it. I used to watch his pigeons. He open loft for many, many years. In fact, he even had some boxes on the outside of the barn, nest boxes, would fly to those. But as he got older, he built a loft and started keeping them in the loft. But he opened the door every morning and closed it every night after dark. When he got past about 75, he quit watering them and they started going down to the pond for a drink, which was probably a half-mile away. Those were some of the strongest pigeons I've ever seen in my life that my grandfather had. After he passed away and we went to pick them up, we had to lock them in because they had gotten kind of wild at nighttime while they were sleeping. And we handled them the next day, and their eyes were incredibly bright and rich. And they were strong, strong pigeons.
That's really cool. It's like the old style of keeping a dovecote, where the pigeons would just go and find their own food and water. And yeah, that would make a strong bird for sure. I could see that.
Yeah, it does. Grandfather, anything that ever showed any canker or any kind of sickness whatsoever, he'd toss it.
You had an article called Learning to Read Birds. And in there, you kind of mentioned kind of what we're talking about right here about the natural way when it comes to feeding and watering and grit. How do you go about using that natural method with your own pigeons?
Pigeons like to fly and forage for food, and that's kind of natural for them. They've done that forever, and they like to roost in a dark place somewhere up high. They like to be up out of the poop up there where they've got some fresh air to breathe. And I raise my pigeons that way. My lofts are 10 foot up in the air to, the place where you're walking, the walking surface. Some of them are 8 foot off the ground, but my main lofts are up in the air really high. And the boxes and the perches are way up off the ground. So I've got boxes that are 7.5 feet up in the air over 8 or 10 feet off the ground. So they may be 17.5 feet off the ground. So they're way up high, but I'm standing on an expanded metal floor inside so I can go in, and I'm pretty tall at 6'4", so I can reach in there and reach in the bowls and pull out the babies to band and look at them. And their droppings fall through that floor all the way to the ground, way down below. I don't have to do any scraping because the floor is always clean. I can walk in there, it's always clean. It's expanded metal, and the droppings collect on the ground down below. And so there's none of the smell or dampness or mold or things that would be inside droppings building up on the floor. And I'm not in there constantly scraping. I know you'll have some guys that say, oh, well, I just clean it up every day. That's awesome if you can do that. But you spend as many years as I have cleaning out pigeon cages as a boy and all your life, you can get a little bit allergic to that dust. I'm not much. It never bothered my grandfather or my father, and it doesn't bother me much, just a little. But I don't have to worry about it in the lofts I have. They don't smell like pigeons. There's no dust floating around in there. The wind or air is blowing underneath the loft. I have 4x4 tube steel posts going up, so snakes can't get up there, mice can't get up there. I never have dogs or anything, raccoons tearing into my cage because they can't get in there. It's all solid 9 gauge steel. And so the birds, they're sitting in the back up in the dark like they would in nature. And then I've got their pan on the ground. A lot of lofts have wooden floors and they can toss the feed around. And I think that's great because the birds can scramble around and get the feed. And the little ones can get as much as the big ones because they can all run around real quick, you know. And I tried to capture some of the same idea by using my own tray that's about 3 foot wide and about 4 feet long, 5 feet long, depending on the loft. And it's about 2.5 inches deep, and it's wood. I lay that on top of the expanded metal floor in the middle, out away from the pigeons, so there's not ever any droppings coming from a perch that would build up in there. So they do have some droppings in there, but I layer it with grit. I buy cheap grit and I'll fill the bottom of it about an inch deep with that grit. And you leave the grit in there, and the birds will peck around in it and poop around in it. But it also helps. I have a wooden feed tray sitting in the middle, and I pour the feed in there. So when they kick seeds out, it's not going on the ground to feed mice and anything else, squirrels that may be coming around. It falls into that tray. And I look at all of that. When I come out in the afternoons to feed at lunchtime, I look, and if the tray has a few seeds left around, I know that the birds are eating about what they need, and I'll keep feeding them the same. But if it's empty and they're climbing the walls like they do when it's really cold, I will add corn and give them extra feed. It's real easy to gauge when you do that. They're just like humans. I think humans probably have gotten so far away from our roots sometimes that it makes children more sickly and more allergic to peanuts and nuts and all kinds of things, probably because they didn't grow up playing in the dirt like most of us old school guys did.
That makes so much sense, though, that you eliminate so many problems just by building the loft correctly, keeping it that high up. So, yeah, you're keeping all the rodents and pests and snakes and stuff out. That expandable steel for a floor, that's definitely the way to go. It's breathable, all the droppings fall through, so you're not getting piled up droppings that can get wet and cause all kinds of other problems and stuff like that. And yeah, you can still drop down a pan in there whenever you want to have, and gives you a lot of control like that. That's just by design. You eliminate so many problems right off the bat. That's a really smart system.
Well, people think that it would be too cold, that the air would come in there, but pigeons have been living in nature for thousands of years. When I was in Siberia, it was 50 below zero the first day I got there on February 8th in 1995, and there were pigeons. I went out on the street at the bazaar, they called it, to buy food and stuff, and there were pigeons walking around there. They were much fatter than ours. I think they had thicker layers of feathers. That's why you always go north to get pigeons with richer, softer, thicker feathers, is because they always have better feather on the birds that are in the cold countries. Yeah, they can take it. And if you've ever taken a cup and you turn it upside down and put it inside your sink full of water, you can see that no water goes up inside the cup. It'll stay full of air. You can take that cup and push it down in the water, and there's air inside that cup, and it won't come out until you flip the cup over, right?
Right.
Well, that loft is the same way. It's up in the air and it's a loft, and the air is going underneath that thing. It doesn't come up into the loft, it goes underneath. And if you want to regulate it, I've got windows down the front and windows on either end. And depending on wind direction and time of the year, I can open those windows anywhere from a little crack all the way to full open in the summer. It stays real nice in there.
Well, let's talk about some of the traits when it comes to looking at a racing pigeon here. Let's start off with feather. You were just mentioning feather there. You know how they say there's different horses for different courses, but what do you look for feather quality in a good racing pigeon?
Soft. I like birds with soft feathers. They need to be strong and firm. I kind of tend to prefer a feather that's a little squared on the end. Not sure that that's a trait that you have to have. I've won with rounded feathered birds too. I think I just prefer the way they lace up. And I love a stack tail. Most people probably aren't familiar with that term. A lot of the terms I use are from old Texas ranch hands and people like my father that lived out in the country all of their life. When you're holding a pigeon and you flip him up and you look at his tail, you can tell that it's blended from the right side of the tail to the left side of the tail, just like you're shuffling cards. You know, when you shuffle cards, every other one, they're layered. And in a good stacked tail, you can see that they're layered. If you turn them upside down and look at the bottom of their tail, right at the end, toward the end of the tail, you can see the layers, how it's stacked real pretty. I like birds that have a nice stacked tail. It tells me that their tail opens and closes the way it's supposed to. They don't have a jacked up tail. Easier for them to fly in side winds, tailwinds. They can control their tail a lot better.
And what about the size of the bird? I always hear the term, they're like a light, quirky kind of feeling bird. What about the size? I know that there's just some bloodlines that just come out really big and some that are almost feral size. Is there any kind of good size to have for universal?
Not really. It's more important about the balance of the pigeon. You know, I try to hang around the medium size. You can take a real strong medium sized pigeon and when it throws a little hen or a little cock bird and you send it to the race and it wins and you bring it home and it's pretty small. But then after it molts out when it's about 18 months old, you'll notice that it's about the same size as the parent. And you're like, oh, well, it's a medium-sized pigeon, but it was just small when I sent it. Those are stronger birds than taking small birds and mating up small birds and sending off small birds that never grow into a medium-sized bird. I'd prefer to have a medium-sized that starts out small and grows into a medium. That being said, balance is the most important thing. You take a pigeon like Willie. Willie was a great producer. His mother bred first place in Portier race over in Europe with 9,635 birds out front. Those were super pigeons, but they were big. They were full brothers and sisters of Birdie. They're Van Loon pigeons. At least the mother was banded by Louis Van Loon. And then the father of Birdie and Ruby, which I owned Ruby, the father goes back to Carl Lewis of Hardy Kruger. A lot of people don't know that. They say Birdie, Birdie, Birdie. But the truth is Birdie goes back to a Jansen and Hardy Kruger, Carl Lewis on top, and then on the bottom it's a Louis Van Loon, straight Louis Van Loon back to the old 954. Those pigeons were big, but they were built excellent, and when you picked them up, they never felt heavy. They're very strong and light, but you can't just go lift up a pigeon and say, well, this one's a light pigeon and it's strong, it's going to work, because some pigeons don't work that way. Some pigeons start out that way, like Easy Money, one of my cockbirds. He's always been real buoyant and he's a good breeder. But I've had other pigeons that were heavy like a little brick in the nest. But after they raced all season and they had 6 or 7 hours on the wing, they came into form and they became buoyant and blown up like little balloons. They were excellent pigeons. It's not a one size fits all.
Eye sign. How much weight do you put in eye sign when it comes to picking out a racing pigeon for you?
I don't know if I should use the word I sign exactly because that points toward I sign theory, which people have written books about, and that's not really what I look at. I look at the bird's eye for health and vibrance. You'll notice when you get back birds from an African race that was a really hard headwind race, like the $1 million race, and you'll pick some of those champions up, first place, second place, third, and you'll hold them in your hand, hold them up to the light, and their eye will vibrate right and left, clockwise and counterclockwise, really, really fast and shake it like a buzz. You can feel it if you got your finger on their head. That doesn't mean they're smart. It doesn't mean they have extra homing ability. What it tells me is they have excellent health. And that's what you want to race with, birds with excellent health, because they can overcome a lot of things.
I've heard about the vibration before, but I never heard about it being like, specifically around the head. And when you're looking at the eye like that, that's really interesting.
Yeah, if you put your finger, you're holding their beak, and you kind of put your finger on the back of their head a little bit there while you're holding it and looking at their eye. You hold it up in the sun, and you'll see it do that zzz, that buzz, and you can feel it with your finger. It's a little buzz. That bird is in absolutely fantastic health. Having birds like that in your loft always contribute to good health. There's other things to look at too. You want a beautiful throat, really nice, even pink. You don't want it to be white or yellowish. You don't want to see a lot of blood veins. You want that hole in the back of the tongue to be laying way down there in the throat, so you have to really tilt the pigeon back to see it down in there. And it needs to be a small, oblong, thin opening. You don't want it to be big and round or having a lot of red veins around it. Those pigeons are no good. I look at the curtain in the back. I want to have a nice straight curtain in there. Don't want to have it too wide for a breeding pigeon, but for a racing pigeon, as long as it's straight, it even, after they race all season, they'll even get a little muscle on those. If you look at those curtains real close with a magnifying glass, you can see that where that little hole in the back of the tongue matches to the curtain at the top half, you'll see some little wrinkles around there after a pigeon's been racing for a full season. Those pigeons are strong.
So I saw an advertisement for your loft, and you had a really interesting quote on there I wanted to talk to you about. So you said the measuring stick for a racer is its race record. The measuring stick for a breeder is its offspring's race record. Clearly, on your website, the pedigrees that you have are very in depth. It has list of wins, the type of all the different races and stuff like that. You see a lot of different racer guys going after just bloodlines. I got this one bloodline, not necessarily a pedigree showing wins. And then there's also the idea of just breeding winners to winners. Can you talk a little bit about how you go about putting together your pedigrees and pairing up the birds that you have? Is it like a winner to winner thing, or are you going off of similarities in different races with each bird?
I've tried all of the above, just about everything you've called out there. I can, quote off different pairings that I've tried that were exactly that, a top racer to a top racer. I've had some of those pairings that were first place to first place, just absolutely barn burners, and put them together and they don't breed anything. But their kids sometimes breed good, which surprised me. Had one that hung around and didn't sell it. And I kind of kept it around, and it was just a good looking bird. And I thought, I'll put you in the loft there and let you foster some babies for me because you're a pretty bird, and didn't feel like culling it. There wasn't anything wrong with it. And then maybe it didn't have eggs laid at the exact same time as somebody I was going to foster. So I'd let it raise its own babies and send them off to a race, and they won. And I was as surprised as anybody else would be. So I learned that sometimes some pigeons will skip a generation. They may not throw good ones, but their kids may. So there's that method. I've had where I put winners together and they bred winners too, but those are more rare. I've had lots of pigeons that were top ace pigeons, really at the top of the sheet, and bring them home and breed them, and they just wouldn't breed a thing. I could move them around to five or six, seven, eight different mates over the several year period that I tried them. And they just wouldn't breed anything. In fact, they would take down good birds. I'd put them on a really good breeding pigeon that I knew was proven. I'd put them on them, and I'd still lose half the babies off of them. The other half would only be mediocre. So you finally have to give up on them. Some pigeons are just not breeders. And that's why I wrote what I wrote. Because just because you have a good racing pigeon, it's not a measuring stick for a breeder. Has nothing to do with it. You'll have guys say, oh, I only breed proven raced pigeons, winners. Well, that's good. Go ahead. You pay the feed bill. I'm happy for you. But I can tell you from long years of experience that not all good racing pigeons breed winners. In fact, I've had birds that's never flown, but they were out of top genetic pairs, and they bred winners for me. A lot of times there's not a rhyme or a reason to it. You have to be real careful when you're culling pigeons because you might throw the baby out with the bathwater.
You can either be a racing pigeon buyer or a racing pigeon breeder. Yeah, I guess it's kind of a crapshoot, like you're saying sometimes, but it kind of happened by accident, but you found a good one that way.
I have. I've done that several times. I even had times where I've had a couple of different instances where I mated up every one of my favorite pigeons, the top creme de la creme, and have two or three or four of each sex left over and throw them in a loft and say, well, I'll just use you guys as fosters and end up sending some of them out to a race and they outbreed everything that I put together. I learn a lot each year, and that's been quite a few years back, but I didn't forget it. Sometimes the pigeons are smarter at picking a mate than we are.
I've heard something about that too, where you have good birds and you just do an open loft and let them kind of choose their mate and go about it that way. Because sometimes they know what's going to be a good mix, what's going to be a healthy mix, and they'll do a better job raising their babies that way.
It's true. I've seen evidence of it, absolute evidence. My favorite way to mix pigeons after all of my different trials and error over the years has been to use a blue blood and put it on a good racing pigeon. It doesn't always have to be a winner. For instance, there's variations on everything. Like some people would say, well, I want a top winning ace pigeon. Yes, me too. Those are good ones to breed. But I've had pigeons that were inbred and I raced them and they didn't top the sheet, but they did their best on like the longest race. And they might not have been the winner, they might have been 60th place. But they were inbred, highly inbred off of champion racers. And I took that bird and mated it to a blue blood and produced one of the biggest winners in the world. Like Mukiwa, that's what she was. I took the first ace pigeon of the Canadian International and the first place 300-mile winner from my buddy Bill Wema out of Canada. And I had another second ace pigeon and first on the final 350 that I picked up from a fellow named Sam. And they were both Hercules pigeons. And I thought, well, I'm going to mate these together. And they were already a little bit inbred. They had some Van Elsacker and stuff, but I inbred them and I sent them to races, like 8 of them. And only one of them turned out any good, but she got better and better and better and better. In the Sierra Ranch Classic, 380 miles, she was like 60th place, but not more than a half hour back or less. And I thought, my goodness, that's the one to breed. So I brought it home and I had a full brother of Easy Money, one of my top producers out of Conbird and Blue Power. And he had never flown, but he was just looked like $1 million. Small, strong, powerful cockbird. And I put that little pair of blue bars together and they bred Mukiwa. And she tore it up over there. She was on the first drop of every car race. And there was thousands of pigeons in that race. I mean, her worst placing was an early race and it was 138th place. That was her worst placing through the entire race. Her next worst placing was 82nd. And then after that, she was third, 17th, 11th, 20th. She was a really good pigeon. But I've done those kind of matings several times and had real good success doing that. Done that with the Porsches too. I'll take a real good hardcore raced pigeon off of some Kuwaiti birds. Those Kuwaiti birds are tough as nails. They're racing across the desert. There's no water to stop and get a drink. They go home. They fly or die. You take some of that stuff and maybe some good old hardcore Africa winners and make you a little family of those, and then you cross them over on those blue blood Porsche pigeons. I've had good luck doing that. I've won quite a bit with those types of crosses. So that's become kind of my go-to. You can inbreed 2 lines. I think you need to fly them and race them and make sure that they're correct. The only way to be for sure bird has a correct body is if you race it and you know that they can race and fly out pretty good. Then they have to be built pretty good, right? You can take 2 inbred lines like that and cross them and do well too. You ask about the size and stuff, and I always talk about balance, and people say, what is that? Is that like you talking about holding them in your hand and they feel balanced? It's more about the balance of features. If you got a bird with a big old heavy body and it's wide and you pull his wing out and his wing looks like a little quail wing, that bird's not going to win any prizes. It'd be lucky if it makes it back to your loft after the race. You want the bird to have adequate wing to carry the body. If you want to win, it can't have too big of a wing and a little body either. It may be able to fly really well, but it's not going to be able to fly fast enough. So all that stuff has to be in balance.
And is there any kind of specific behavioral traits that you find with good racers tend to have, whether they're a little bit wily or maybe they're even more docile, or is there anything like that that you've ever noticed that the good ones usually have?
I've grabbed hold of a lot of Africa winners when I went to Africa, and birds that I've bought that were right at the top 10, in that top 10 group. I've bought quite a few of those from Africa. And those pigeons tend to be small to medium and stout. They're not what I'd call big or anything or huge boned, but they're stout. They're strong boned, I would say, strong bodied, and they're strong willed pigeons. Many of them, you'll grab their beak and they'll twist it back and forth. They close their eyes and twist it back and forth and yank it out of your hand. Those are pretty hard-nosed pigeons with a lot of determination, in my opinion. I've also seen some that were really calm, nicest little gentle pigeons you've ever seen. And they come home like gangbusters when that door gets opened. Some of the speed pigeons are generally a little larger and they're a little more hard muscled and hard bodied, and they have a longer keel, usually longer body. Whereas the long distance pigeons, if you get a hold of the champions, the ones that actually win the race, you'll notice they generally have a shorter keel. Those are things that I've found over the years and I look at when I'm putting together pairs. And today I sent 9 more babies to the Africa Pro,
Oh, okay.
and while I was pulling them out of there, I was checking to see if they had deep enough bodies. You don't want them huge, but you want a bird with a deep enough body. I got my butt kicked over there in Africa enough to, I figured out that they have a little deeper body than some of the faster pigeon races.
Yeah, you really got to know your birds, I guess, too, about, when you're picking, especially for these one loft races, when you're picking them young, you got to know through experience, like in your case, what it's going to grow into.
It'll make you nuts sometimes, especially when you're trying to enter. Like I usually enter about 5 races in the U.S. I'll pick out 5 of them. It's not the same ones every year. I switch around a lot. Some of them I've never raced in. There's a lot of races out there I've never even entered, but I will probably in the future. I'm just making my way through them. I send to, like Big Andes. When I set out to win that thing, I made it a Jansen to a Leo Herman's because I felt like that was going to get me the speed. And the Jansen was a Jansen that had won in Africa, a Kuwaiti bird. And I said, okay, he'll put some powder in there with the speed. And sure enough, I did. I've won over there a couple of times, but you have to really think about the race you're sending to. You take the same exact pigeons and you can send them over to the Hoosier and you'll get your butt kicked. You may not even get on the board, or you send them to Africa Pro and you're 96th place on the final with your best bird. It takes a lot of thought. So if you're entering 5 or 6 races in the U.S. and you're trying to send a couple to Pattaya and maybe to Portugal over there to the Golden Algarve or something like that, you start spreading yourself out. And a lot of these places are taking birds at the same time, and you're trying to pair your birds to work, and you only have 12 main breeding pair. It can be a hair pulling experience trying to think about all of that stuff and get it right.
Yeah, all the courses are different and you want to send different birds. Yeah, it's a lot of variables.
It is. When I sent to the $1 million race, I would have been on the drop, but my bird did an extra circle. There was 4 birds on the drop. Mine was with them, but she chose to make another loop, and then she came and landed. Her name was BB-8, and that was out of Said and Mila. And Said was a tough Kuwaiti pigeon that had won there before, and I knew he could handle it. And then Mila was a little blue blood, real soft feathered, small, stocky little hen from Franz von Wildermeer's. I'd went over there and visited him, and he had some national champions paired up, and I picked some good babies off of them and brought them back. But anyway, I paired them up because I knew they'd be small and strong boned and soft feathered and soft spongy muscle. And I figured they'd do good in Africa. And I had one pigeon and I'd sent 6. But like 3 or 4 of them died in the quarantine on the way over there. So I ended up like 3 entries. And then 2 of them, one got lost right away when they took the nets off, and the other one didn't last very long. So I was racing the whole time with one pigeon. I got to the final race. That bird came in, and it was the first knockout winner. It was the first bird home that was still in the knockout out of 56 pigeons that were left, starting with like 5,800. So I was really proud of that little pigeon. I still have her here. She's breeding for me. But when I went to Big Andy's, I knew that wasn't going to work. I mean, I could have sent a bird like that, and I'm sure they would have shown up. They might even gotten some of the money, but they weren't going to win that race. It's a different kind of a race. So I put that sage pigeon on that big Leo Herman's hen that had won over at Portugal's Golden Algarve. And those pigeons are generally big, solid, medium-sized pigeons. Like if you've ever handled, Mike Gannis has a bird called Thomas Six, and I handled it after he got it home over here at his place. And it's a big, solid pigeon. It's a super, super nice bird. It's not small. I mean, it's a big, solid medium. And Dino was the same way. She was fifth ace pigeon out of 5,500 birds. She was seventh place on the final race out of 3,644 birds released. And she was a Leo Herman's. But I put that pair together and I thought that'll get it done. And it did. That's the kind of things that you have to think about sending to these races. Because I promise you that Hippolyta pigeon is a gorgeous pigeon, and she's built like $1,000,000, but she wasn't going to come in on an Africa headwind 411 miles or 350 or 380 in the heat.
We're coming up against the clock here, but I want to thank you for this. This has been, really informative. I really appreciate you sharing all your information and your experiences with us. And if anybody wants to find out more, you can check out his website, KenEasleyRacingPigeon.com, and you can look at all the different pedigrees. And you're going to, he mentioned a lot of different pigeons here by name, so you can look up some of those. Conbird is obviously a big one on there. He has a long list of pedigrees with that. Ken, thank you so much for coming on and talking with us today.
You're most welcome. I enjoyed it, Philip.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the All About Pigeons podcast. Please help the pigeon hobby by telling your fellow club members or other pigeon friends about the podcast, and make sure to leave a good review or at least a 5-star for the podcast wherever you listen. If you have a topic or a person you want to hear more about on the podcast, or if you yourself would like to be a guest, just send an email to allaboutpigeonspodcast@gmail.com. Thanks for listening.